What do we celebrate tomorrow? Memorial Day. Okay. What is that? What is that? What are we celebrating? Remembering the soldiers that have passed away. Yeah, I mean, these men and women who have died made the ultimate sacrifice, right? So that we would have safety and for the strength of our country and so on. Tomorrow will be a time of remembering these soldiers that died. But today, we come together to honor the man Jesus who made the ultimate sacrifice, right? And he gave his life to save our souls from hell and to draw us to him, to draw us to God. And so we want to remember him today. Remembering this sacrifice actually takes us to our first question in our question and answer series. Our first question, which has to do with the night before the crucifixion, and when Jesus was in the garden and he was arrested. And I want you for just a few minutes, at least for the first question, take your minds back to the garden. Back to the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was being arrested. He had been praying and everything. And so let's take our minds back there as we look at the first question. But before we do, I have to grab something right quick. Need the clicker. Nothing like being prepared. Okay. The first question is, when Jesus was being arrested, why did the soldiers fall back when he said, I am he? Have you ever wondered that? When you think about that question, let's just look at the passage and kind of get some context here. It's in John chapter 18, verses 3-6. Let's read it here. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, Whom are you seeking? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Well, Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. No, wait. Now let's get this context. Let's understand the situation. These were trained soldiers. Okay? These were military guys. They weren't afraid of much. And they came out with their lanterns and their torches and their weapons. They were armed. They were prepared for a confrontation. Because you remember the Jews have tried to have Jesus arrested in the past, and every time without success. And so it was an emotionally charged situation at that time. And so Jesus approached them, these armed soldiers. He's unarmed. He approaches these armed soldiers. And he approached them and asked who they're looking for. They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, first of all, I want you to notice how they answered. They answered, Jesus of Nazareth. Very few people ever called him Jesus of Nazareth. But what they did in doing that, I believe, is they refused to give him the honor that belonged to him. They refused to call him the Christ. It was like, Jesus of Nazareth, just another criminal. But that's what they said. And when Jesus said to them, I am he, it says they drew back and fell to the ground. Why? They were armed. Why would they do that? Something that's very unique about the King James and the New King James is that sometimes you have to, they supplied words in the text. And when they supplied words, they italicized them to show we added this word for clarification. In other words, when translating from one translation or from one language to another, sometimes you have to supply a word for it to make sense to the reader, for clarity. And so they would add some words once in a while, same meaning, but they would add a word for us to understand, and it would be more in our vernacular, our language. So let's look a little closer at verse 6. Now, when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, what do you notice here? He is italicized. What does that mean? It wasn't in the original text. In fact, I went back to the original Greek, and he is not there. It simply says, and Jesus simply said, I am. What is significant about Jesus saying, I am? That's the name of God. You remember God told Moses in Exodus 3:14, I believe it is, that go tell them, I am has sent you. God said, I am. And so this refers to the name of God. And the Jews that were there would have immediately been struck by this I am statement. Because he didn't say, I am he. He simply said, I am. And when the soldiers heard this, they also seemed to understand that this was a claim by him to be God. And this frightened the soldiers. So they drew back from him and fell to the ground. It frightened them. Isn't that interesting? If you were a soldier, armed or not, would you not be a little bit frightened by the fact that you were there trying to arrest God? And not only that, they would have been struck by his commanding presence. He wasn't hiding behind a rock or behind all the disciples or anything. He stepped forward with a commanding presence. It was obvious that he was in command of the whole situation. And I believe that even in this dark hour of Jesus' life, he's making it clear that he holds the ultimate power over his enemies. And yet he allows them to arrest him so that God's plan could be fulfilled. Does that make sense? You see, Jesus would not be arrested. They could not arrest Jesus without his permission. And in his commanding of this situation, he didn't give up a fight, but he allowed himself to be given to them so that the plan of redemption could be fulfilled. Now, this wasn't the first time they had heard him use this phrase, I am. Back in John 8, let me just look at a couple of examples. In John 8, verse 24, he said, therefore I say to you that you will die in your sins, for if you do not believe that I am he, italicized, you will die in your sins. Do you see that? And then a few verses later, in verse 28, Jesus said to them, when you lift up the Son of Man, when you know, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father taught me, I speak these things. Notice in both of these, the word he was an addition to give us clarification. Because if somebody says, in our language, if somebody says, hey, who did the, or who is this, or whatever, and we wouldn't say, I am, we would say, I'm he, Somebody calls you and says, hey, I want to speak to so-and-so, I'm he, And so it's done for our clarification, but Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said, I am. And if that wasn't clear enough, a few verses later in verse 58, Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. If they didn't get that message, he made it very clear, I am deity. I am God. That's what he was saying when the soldiers came and said, we're seeking Jesus of Nazareth. He said, I am. No wonder they fell back to the ground. Have y'all ever wondered that? Now you know. Now you know the reason. Second question. Wow. Where did Adam and Eve settle after getting kicked out of the garden? Anybody ever wonder that question? Where did Adam and Eve settle after getting kicked out of the garden? You talk about a stump the chump question. Does anybody know? Let's try to figure it out. First of all, if we want to know where they went after they were kicked out of the garden, let's go back a little further than that and find out, where is the Garden of Eden? Does anybody know where the Garden of Eden is or was? Huh? It was somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, Tigris and Euphrates was mentioned. In fact, let's look. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, it says, the Lord God planted a garden where? Eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So we know it's eastward. Eastward from what? Well, probably eastward from where whoever was writing this was writing it from, I would think, right? So from the right, who wrote Genesis anyway? Moses. So from his perspective, let's just look. From his perspective, and he would have been somewhere around Canaan, probably in the wandering of the wilderness when he wrote it, so somewhere around close to Canaan. What is east? A desert and Mesopotamia, right? Mesopotamia is this whole region right through here. Mesopotamia means land between the rivers, and you can clearly on this map see two rivers, right? Okay, so that's my first clue, is he said the garden was eastward. I would think east of where he was, where he wrote this. So the east of Canaan, across the desert, that's Mesopotamia. By the way, the word Eden comes from the Hebrew word meaning delight, which you can imagine of the Garden of Eden. It would have been delightful. The garden would have been in a place of life-giving water. Would you agree with that? It would have been very fertile land, which Mesopotamia was because of the rivers. So it would have been a very fertile land where God abundantly provided for Adam and Eve. And we're told that 4 rivers flowed from the garden. The Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Now, do you recognize any of those? Which ones? The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Okay. Where are they? They're in Mesopotamia, right? This is the Euphrates River. And this is the Tigris River right here, okay? So we have a clue. A river runs out from Eden, and 2 of them at least, or we know 4 of them, the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. So it seems that it has to be in this area, right? So we're getting close. Excuse me. So we're getting kind of close. So again, Mesopotamia basically just means the land between the rivers. It was a very, very fertile land. Yes. The question, was that a part of the Fertile Crescent? The Fertile Crescent consisted of starting down here through this fertile area and then down into here. And it's a crescent shape. So that's the Fertile Crescent. All of this, even though this map shows it kind of green, all this is desert. And so it was a crescent going around the desert. So, good question. So are we getting close? Seems like it. Maybe. All right. Now, these 2 rivers, They actually originate, if you look, do you see up at the top of the map where it says Armenia? Right here. They actually start here and here. They start in the Armenian mountains. They flow down through Mesopotamia. They connect here and flow into the Persian Gulf. You see where they connect, right? Okay. So we're just trying to work through this and try to see if we can figure it out. Now, obviously, the geography would be somewhat different after the Great Flood than it possibly was before. But at least we have a general idea of the area that the Garden of Eden might have been in. Would you agree? Okay. Let's go a little bit further. There have been two main proposals for the location of the Garden of Eden. There's a few more, but a couple of them doesn't make sense. One of them's way down in Africa because of the mention of somebody by the name of Cush, or a land of Cush, which is below Egypt. But there was also a Cush in Mesopotamia, so that doesn't really hold water. But anyway, two main suggestions that make sense. One of them is in the Armenian mountains where these two rivers start. So right in here. That's one suggestion. Okay. The second suggestion is southern Mesopotamia right in here. I'm just going to go on record and saying that's my guess. I vote for that one. Huh? That one is eastward, and that one has a place where the rivers actually join together. Because we're told that there's a river that flows from the garden, and it branches out into four rivers. Two of them are right here. Now, there are two other rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon, that we don't know where they are now. But many scholars believe, and archaeologists believe, that they were probably rivers, or possibly rivers, that flowed off of these mountains right here. The Ziggurat Mountains. And that they would have flowed out of those mountains into those rivers and joined as well. That's not for sure. That's just a guess, okay? That's just a guess. I like the guess. But the Ziggurat Mountains is what it's called. So we're getting pretty close. Now, y'all want to follow this little guessing game and rabbit trail a little bit further? Let's go a little bit further. You remember after the flood, and Noah and his descendants came out and built the ark and all, and eventually they somehow migrated down to southern Mesopotamia, right? They migrated back to there, where they built a tower. What was the name of the tower? Tower of Babel. Where was that? It was in Babel or Babylon. Babylon and Babel are the same city, which is right here in southern Mesopotamia. Why would they go back there? I don't know. Maybe that's where they had come from originally. I'm not sure. But I just think it's interesting that they migrated back there. In Genesis 11, they built the tower. And something else interesting about this region is, and I'm going to switch to another map. And so here's the land of Canaan over here. To the east is southern Mesopotamia. There's the Zagros Mountains, where the other two rivers may have come off of. But this area is also the area of Sumer. How many of you ever heard of Sumer? Sumer is where the Sumerians, not the Sumerians, but the Sumerians were from in southern Mesopotamia. It is the oldest known civilization that we know about. It was a very advanced civilization. This society developed one of the first forms of writing known as cuneiform, basically pictures. And they also were very advanced in agriculture, irrigation, architecture, math, and astronomy. Yeah. It is also where Abraham is from. Yes. Um, and so they also had the Sumerians, even in that old time, had indoor plumbing and restaurants, taverns, like a seafood restaurant, a fish restaurant. And as you just mentioned, Abraham was called out of where? Which is right here. Babylon is here. All of this is southern Mesopotamia. That's where the oldest civilization was. And all I'm saying here is that this area seemed to have been a central location for early civilization. It would kind of make sense that perhaps that's where they settled and began civilization as they began to kind of spread throughout that area. And then why possibly the people after the flood would have come back to there, because that's where they knew. So, if the Garden of Eden was in southern Mesopotamia, which is eastward from the writer, it certainly wouldn't be in the desert east, right? You go further, what do you have? Southern Mesopotamia. So this area seems to be that location, and so this is also where Abraham came from, as I said. So the Garden of Eden was likely somewhere in Mesopotamia. That's at least my guess. Now, wherever Adam and Eve went after they were kicked out of the garden, I would guess that it would be very likely or probable that they would not have gone far. There would be no reason to go far because they were in an area that was fertile, had plenty of water, and things like that. So possibly, where did they settle? Possibly southern Mesopotamia. But maybe not. This is all conjecture. That's the best guess I can come up with from the information that we're given. Okay? Some have even said, I've seen some maps and things that show that it's actually here. That now the Persian Gulf, that it's in what is now the Persian Gulf, that it's actually under the water, so that no one could get to it. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that it's not true. But just an interesting guess. So that's the general area. Whether it's under the water of the Persian Gulf or whether it's up above that, Eden, I don't think they would have traveled far when they got out of there. There would be no reason to leave that fertile area to go somewhere else. Make sense? Simply a guess. Let's move on. Third question. Do we know what tribes any of the disciples or apostles and Jesus' parents belonged to? And did the 12 apostles represent each of the 12 tribes? In other words, the questioner was wanting to know, kind of, was each apostle represent each tribe, one from Judah, one from Benjamin, one from Issachar, things like that. Let's start with the easy one, Jesus' parents. All right, who were Jesus' parents? Mary and Joseph. Okay. Jesus was promised to be from the lineage of the royal family of David and also from Judah, right? And so they're from Judah. In fact, a question earlier from our genealogy in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3, we see that both Joseph and Mary came through the lineage of David, who came from Judah. So the easy answer to that question about Jesus' parents, they were from the tribe of Judah. Okay? Now, for the harder one, what about the 12 apostles or disciples? Either way. Did the 12 apostles represent each of the 12 tribes? In other words, was each one of them from a different one of the tribes? Well, first of all, Matthew may have been from the tribe of Levi, because he's also called Levi. Okay? In Matthew 2:14, he's called Levi, but that's Matthew. And so he probably was from the tribe of Levi. Okay? Paul, we know, even though he is not one of the original 12, Paul, we're told in Romans 11, verse 1, that he was from Benjamin. So we'll go ahead and get that out of the way. But now the other ones, the Bible does not record where they're from. Oh, people have speculated and people have gone to different sources here and there, and they think they might have figured out a few of them. But the Bible doesn't specifically record where they're from, which tells me it probably doesn't matter where they're from. But it is true, there are 12 tribes and there are 12 apostles, right? But among the apostles, at least 2 sets of them are brothers, right? Peter and Andrew and James and John, they're brothers. That kind of tells us that those brothers are from the same, each one of those are from the same tribe. Then the other 2 brothers are from the same tribe. They may have all 4 been from the same tribe. We don't know. That in itself rules out the idea that each disciple or apostle was from a separate one of the tribes. Okay? And the other thing, a couple other things to consider about this is that for the most part, most of the Galileans, or most of the apostles were Galileans. Remember, it says, are these all not Galileans? And so they were Galileans, and according to John 1:44 and 45, Philip and Nathanael, now the Nathanael is the same person as Bartholomew, okay? So Philip and Bartholomew are from the same town they're from the same town as Peter and Andrew. So they're probably from the same tribe as Peter and Andrew. All of that to say this, that the tribal allotments, when the land was separated into tribes, and the laws of inheritance tended to keep tribes together, right? You'd have Judah here and Benjamin up here, and Dan and Naphtali and Gad, and they would sort of stay together when they first were done, right? And that generally stayed that way. So it would seem pretty much just from this information that it would be pretty much impossible for the 12 tribes to be represented by the 12 apostles individually. Okay? Now, a couple other things to consider about this question is that although the Bible, in all through the Bible, the number 12 represents authority, completeness, and the number of the 12 apostles does represent the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 tribes in the Old Testament, only from the standpoint as being a complete number, a number of authority from God. Okay? And these 12 had authority from God. Okay? And so, and also when you consider the fact, if you think about the history, you remember the kingdom divided? There was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were taken away into Assyrian captivity, never to return, right? How many were left? The 2 with Judah, which was basically in that area would have been Judah. Benjamin kind of stayed with Judah. The Levites would have been down there because the Levites were spread throughout all of the tribes, right? Because they were the teachers. And then Simeon had their territory actually within the territory of Judah. And so likely the only tribes that would have been around would have been your Judah, Benjamin, Levites, and maybe Simeon. Now, the exception to that would be that some of when the northern kingdom was so evil and the southern kingdom was doing good, some of the tribes in the northern kingdom did defect down into the southern kingdom. So there may be some exceptions to that. There may be some Issachars and Zebulons and people like that mixed in. But for the most part, you can see from this that there's not one apostle for each tribe. Answer that question. Now, the only one that really matters, the question really, is the parents of Jesus, being from the tribe of Judah, because that means Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. As was promised, this fulfills the promise of God that the Redeemer of the world would come from the tribe of Judah. Now, I want you to think about something as we conclude, because I only had 3 questions for today. And it's good because I'm about to lose my voice. But I want you to think about something. The promise was made. We can go back to the Garden of Eden, right? That we just discussed, that we don't know exactly where it is, maybe in southern Mesopotamia. Way back in the Garden of Eden, where there were only 2 people on the earth, a promise was made for Jesus. Later in Genesis, the promise was made that Jesus would come from the tribe of Judah. Genesis 49:10 says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah." Later, the promise is made to David that his family would endure forever. The kingdom will not depart from David's family. Jesus came from the tribe of David, or from the royal family of David. Isn't it amazing that a promise that was made that long ago was kept perfectly? You know why? God is in control. The promise is from God. God promises us salvation through this man of Jesus. If he kept that other promise, guess what other promise he'll keep? Promise of salvation for those who will accept Jesus. We're about to sing a song of invitation. As I look out, everybody here is Christians. Sometimes we become weak. Sometimes we need to come back to the Lord. Sometimes we need to renew our commitment to God. And as we sing a song, I want you to think about the power of the promises of God. And the fact that through that promise, he sat on his throne and watched his son die. I don't know if I could have done that. God loved you that much. Jesus loved you that much. Make sure that he's on top of your priority list. Make sure that he is the one that drives your life. Think about your life, how we can help you as we stand and sing.